Hi, thank you. Thank you for coming. Welcome to BLP Lecture 6. This is BLP Lecture 6 with a difference, because it won't be delivered by one of us tutors, the usual crowd. We instead have a guest speaker. It's Mr. David Lacey, who's a partner in structured finance in Stevenson Harwood. So you'll be hearing from a practitioner's perspective rather than a tutor's perspective. We hope it's useful and interesting. And over to you, David.
Good morning and thank you. And I'm pleased to see so many people here today to learn a bit about debt finance. I see you've already been provided with this. I think everyone's seen a copy of that, so you've already got most of my best lines, but I think there'll be a few things that weren't in there. We're going to be looking at the use of debt finance, and I'm going to do it in the context of companies raising money. So there won't be anything in this talk relating to consumer finance, which is a very specific and in many ways quite a separate area. So we're going to be focusing here on the application of these principles to companies. We're talking about debt finance as opposed to, you think of the debt finance, there must be some other kind of finance, otherwise we wouldn't need the debt word. Debt finance as opposed to equity finance. And when you're talking about how companies raise money, that is the classic distinction in terms of how they raise money. Equity finance, just to look at that briefly so we can then discard it for the rest of the talk, describes a situation where a company goes to its shareholders and raises money from its shareholders by the issue of shares. That's the very simplest way of looking at it. And that funding, that provides cash for the company in the same way that borrowing money would, but legally it has quite a different nature. Shareholder funds, for example, once they're in the company, it's very difficult to get them out again. Right? For a company to return share capital to its shareholders is very difficult. That money on a liquidation will only go back to shareholders once all of the debts of the company have been discharged. So in other words, it ranks at the very, very bottom of the chain when it comes to the company assets being distributed on a liquidation. And that means that from an accounting perspective, from a tax perspective, from a legal perspective, they have quite different treatments and therefore quite different uses. What we're going to look at today is companies raising money by way of debt finance. That is where they go and borrow money. And that's an expression that you'll often see in legal documents. Money's in the nature of borrowings, borrowed monies. And the companies can do this in a really quite wide variety of ways. The most obvious is by borrowing it, and most of us will have familiar with that idea. You go to the bank lends you money, you pay the bank interest, you repay the principal. With companies, we can achieve that same economic effect in quite a wide variety of ways, which is one of the challenges when you're drafting documents, because if you just restricted the company from borrowing, the company's lawyers would come up with another dozen ways of achieving the same result without a borrowing. I'm not going to be talking today about all those different ways in which you can achieve the same result. So when we talk about borrowings, just be conscious of the fact that you can achieve the same effect as a bank borrowing, but in a number of different ways. And they go by different descriptions, just to make it even more interesting. You'll hear companies have borrowed money, they've taken out a loan. They've issued a bond. The legal effect is exactly the same. The bond is simply document evidencing an indebtedness. Right? An IOU. The company has issued loan notes. All of these are labels for different kinds of debt instruments, many of which have exactly the same legal consequences, but the bankers who sell them can charge you more money if it's got a fancy label. So one of the things to watch out for is you see all these different labels applied to what is fundamentally the same thing. You have borrowed money. Not all debt, though, is a borrowing. So here's another distinction. One way a company can raise money, to put it very loosely, is by delaying payments to their suppliers. So I supply legal services on credit to my clients. I'd like them to pay their bills on time. That's good for me. The clients say, wait a minute, if we pay David's bills 90 days after we get them, instead of 7 days after we get them, then that's going to be good for our cash flow. And it is. It's very good for their cash flow. Happens to be very bad for my cash flow. Right? What I am doing, in effect, is lending them money, right, from an economic perspective. They have the benefit of money that should be mine. Okay? When we talk about debt finance, usually trade credit will be excluded from that calculation. In other words, banks and accountants don't view trade credit as being in the nature of a borrowing. Mind you, in loan documents, you'll often see that if that trade credit extends beyond a certain time, then it does become treated by the banks as a borrowing. If you're stretching your creditors out 90, 100, 120 days, at some point the bank will say, wait a minute, that is economically in the nature of a borrowing. So be conscious of that not all debt represents borrowed monies, and trade credit is an important area of funding for a company that isn't included in this concept of debt finance. So we're looking at companies raising money in the nature of a borrowing. And that's got an important balance sheet consequence. Now, if you've seen basic company balance sheets, you'll see there are assets and liabilities. Assets on one side, liabilities on the other. That's how double entry bookkeeping has worked for the last 400, 500 years. Okay? And to be solvent, you need to have assets that exceed your liabilities. If your assets are less than your liabilities, then you're insolvent. Right? That's one of the two statutory tests for solvency. Do you have assets that exceed your liabilities? The other statutory test, can you meet your debts as they fall due? That second one is a cash flow test. Right, so we see two tests there. Assets versus liabilities, a balance sheet test of solvency, and a cash flow test. Can you pay your debts as and when they fall due? Right. You can have quite significant assets. You can own a big house in the country and not be able to pay your gardener because you haven't got any cash flow. Right, so you need both of those. The distinction between debt and equity finance is important to the first of those tests. Right. Do you have assets that exceed your liabilities? Because borrowings on your balance sheet represent a liability. And you need to have assets that outweigh those liabilities. And your solvency is done on that test. Your shareholder funds do not represent a liability from the point of view of judging balance sheet solvency. So, because that liability to the shareholders ranks so far behind everybody else, right, from a balance sheet test, do you have assets that exceed your liabilities? You count debt finance in that test, but not the equity finance. So, if you load up on debt rather than equity as a way of raising money, you need to make sure that that doesn't tip the balance sheet into insolvency. It's one of the useful tricks, though, for restoring a company to solvency. What do you do with a company that has not got assets that exceed its liabilities? What we can do is we convert some of that debt into equity. And by converting it into equity, we now have restored our balance sheet solvency. The assets are still the same as they were, but the liabilities have been reduced because we've converted some of those liabilities, the borrowings, into equity. And that's quite a useful trick on a restructuring to relieve the debt burden on a company. Now you might ask, well, why would a lender who ranks up here on insolvency want to convert himself into an equity holder who ranks at the bottom? Okay. Now, one reason is because if the company goes broke, you'll get nothing. Right? So having a chance of getting something is better than having no chance of getting anything. Right? So a bank, for example, might say, I'll convert half of the borrowings into shares to enable the company to survive and indeed to prosper. And as it prospers, the shares will increase in value. So the bank says, in effect, I'm taking an equity risk on this company because all the assets don't match the liabilities. I might as well be getting an equity return. Because one of the things about equity is you're taking a much higher risk. Remember, you rank behind everybody else. Logically, you would expect a higher return. So an equity risk should be matched by an equity return. Debt is much cheaper. It's much cheaper because the risks are lower. So why would you want equity if it's got such greater risk? Well, you'd want it because you'll get a much greater return. There are people who make a living out of taking risks. Make a living taking big risks. And that's useful because particularly startup companies, you go to the bank and you say, I've got this great idea. I've designed this smartphone application. You explain to the bank what a smartphone is. And it enables people to communicate instantly with their friends by sending them photos that then evaporate seconds after they've been sent. And the bank says, why on earth would I lend you any money for that? Right? Whereas you go to the equity investor who says, there is almost no chance of that ever catching on. Right? But if it does catch on, it'll be worth a fortune. That's where the equity investor provides the equity finance. Very high risk, very high reward if it works. But of course, he knows he's going to lose on 9 out of 10 of his investments. Right? Just as a boxing promoter, right, takes a third of the boxer's purse because he's had to also bring through 9 other boxers who didn't make the grade. Right? So equity investors have a very different outlook on things than debt providers. Right? Debt providers much more conservative, taking lower risk for lower return. And that's important if you're looking at how you finance a company. Right? You might say, well, to have the strongest balance sheet, to ensure I'll always be solvent, I'm going to raise all my money by equity finance. So I'll put in my own resources. And then I'll go to other equity providers and get them to contribute equity. And now I'll have a really strong balance sheet because I went to this talk that said I've got to have assets that exceed my liabilities. All this equity doesn't count as a liability on my balance sheet. I'll have a really strong balance sheet. But in reality, you won't want to do that because the people who contribute equity are going to want to say in how the company is run. They're going to say, we're taking some very significant risks here. We're shareholders in the company. We want to say in the makeup of the board. We want to say in who the directors are. We want to say in the commercial direction the company is going to take. We want a really close involvement in our very high-risk investment. And you, the entrepreneur, watch your stake in this business shrink more and more and more as you've gathered in all this equity. So, on the other hand, you might say, well, I've got some equity, now I'm going to go and look for some debt finance. And you go to a bank and you borrow money. And that's called leverage. Right? It's how you gear up your company. By borrowing money, that magnifies the effect, because you put the bank's money with your money, the business grows. All you have to do is pay the bank the interest and the loan. All the growth that we call equity goes to you. Right? So you could take £10 of your own money, borrow £100 from the bank, gives you 110, double your money, 220. You only have to give back the bank 100 plus interest, and you've got all this surplus cash. I'm not going to do the numbers because lawyers are never any good with numbers, but you got more cash than you would have done if you'd only been playing with your own £10. So this idea of gearing up the business, right, you'll hear used, where the company goes and borrows money, thus magnifying the effect of the growth. Right? You see exactly the same thing in the housing market. Right? The bank says put up 10% of your own money. Right? These days it says put up 40% of your own money. Right? The bank then lends you the balance, you buy the house price can only go up, right? You pay off the bank and that extra growth in the house price is yours. What a fantastic deal. Right? Such a fantastic deal that banks used to lend you 120% of the value of your home. You didn't even have to put in your own equity. The bank would not only lend you the equity, they'd even give you some extra to go on holidays. What could possibly go wrong with that? There are no doubt books written on that topic. So, gearing up is a way for the company to magnify the profit-creating potential. Equally, gearing works both ways. Right? It also magnifies the loss-making potential. Right? Because, of course, if the business shrinks, you've still got to pay off the bank and you wind up with nothing. So, you will hear this expression, gearing, and the challenge for the finance director at the company is to work out the right mix of equity finance and debt finance. He's not going to want to use all equity finance because that's very expensive and very inflexible. He's not going to want to use all borrowings because even if he wanted to, the banks wouldn't let him. No bank these days will lend you 100% of the value of the asset. They always want you to have something at risk in the asset to avoid the moral hazard. If all you're doing is playing with the bank's money, what history tells us is you're not nearly so careful as if you're playing with a bit of your own money as well. Right? So banks want to see the company at risk to suffer if the business doesn't go well. So the finance director is balancing these two things. And they have different consequences, for example, in terms of the financing, in the tax treatment. So, for example, interest that the company pays on its borrowings is generally tax deductible. Dividends paid on shares are not deductible. Right? A company can only pay dividends on its shares from distributable profits and reserves. Whereas it always has to pay the interest on the loan, and it can pay it from whatever source it wants. But you can only pay dividends from distributable profits and reserves. No profits, no dividends. Which kind of makes sense because the shareholders shouldn't be getting money if the company's not making a profit. Now, do bear in mind that profit does not equal cash at bank. You can have cash at bank without having profits. Equally, you can have profits without having any cash at bank. Right? And that's why you may read companies borrowing money to pay a dividend. You think, wait a minute, but why on earth they shouldn't be borrowing money to pay a dividend, because they should only pay a dividend if they've got profit. But because profit is an accounting analysis, an accounting exercise, it is possible to have an accounting profit but no cash. Right? So the companies will borrow money to pay the dividend. Okay? So dividends only from distributable profits and reserves, and that is not the same as cash. So if you were a shareholder in a company, you might say, looking at all of this, I'm willing to put up £100 into this company. If I put it all in as equity, I won't get any return unless there are distributable profits. And in most startups, that's not going to happen in year one. Probably won't even be happening in year 3. So maybe I should lend it all to the company. That'd be better. So I'll put in £2 as share capital, because the lawyers tell me you have to have something in there. So I'm going to put in £2 as share capital, and I'm going to lend the company the other £98. And that would be much more flexible from the investor's perspective, because remember, to get debt repaid is simply a matter of the contract between the parties as to what the terms are for repayment. The law doesn't impose restrictions on you repaying debts. It does put restrictions on you returning share capital to your shareholders. And, says our shareholder, the interest that I get paid, which represents for me a return on my £100, is tax deductible for the company, which will mean that the company I'm investing in will do even better, because when it does make profits, it'll have some tax deductions to offset against the profits. So I'm going to put in £2 as share capital and £98 worth as debt. It won't surprise you to know that any time you see a favourable tax treatment, the revenue eventually gets hold of it and stops it. Right? And you'll hear this expression, thin capitalisation rules. And the thin capitalisation rules are the revenue's way of saying you have too much debt and too little equity, as far as we're concerned. Right? You're only doing that, you're only structuring it that way in order to get a tax deduction for the interest, and the company is getting too big a tax deduction. And so what the thin capitalisation rules say is that if you've got too much debt and too little equity, the revenue will deem some of that debt to be equity, and thus some of that interest as being a dividend for tax purposes, and therefore denying the tax deduction. So with all of this financing structure, there is a hefty tax element to it. Tax is a very specialised subject done by people who live and breathe tax, and it's an area in which any practitioner will tell you you dabble at your peril. Right? So here's another suggestion. If ever you have a tax question, you get a tax lawyer. Right? Tax is not a DIY subject. Right? Do not be tempted to have a go. But it's useful to know some of the jargon, so when someone in the meeting says thin capitalisation problem, you can nod very sagely, right? Waiting for your tax colleague to come up with the answer. Right? So the tax treatment of debt finance and equity finance will be different. And the way that returns are paid on debt finance and equity finance are different. And the skill of the finance director is to find that optimum balance between borrowed monies and equity. Equity, of course, can be structured in a whole range of different ways. You'll see ordinary shares, you'll see non-voting shares, shares that provide an economic benefit but no voting, preference shares that get a dividend ahead of other shares, cumulative preference shares where the preferential claim accumulates over the years. You can structure equity in as many imaginative and creative ways as you can structure the debt. And no doubt you'll have separate talks on how you do equity finance. But the flexibility and the creativity is what you get paid for as a lawyer. Right? And that's what makes it interesting. Right? The clients will come to you and say, how do I deal with this problem? The answer is, well, let's give this guy the voting shares but no economic return, and this person no voting shares but with the economic return, if that's what the parties want. And that's relevant because on an insolvency, the interests of the equity holders will be determined by the articles of the company. Now, says our bank, how do I know I'm going to get the money back? And the starting point by the borrower is, because I've told you I'll pay you back the money. And the bank says, yeah, that's a good place to start. What more can you do for me? Right? What can we do for the bank to enable the bank to get back its money ahead of everybody else? Because that's what you want as the banker, don't you? Sometimes that's what you want. Because what's the effect? If we come up with a structure that means the bank gets paid ahead of everybody else, what have we done to the banker's risk? We've reduced the banker's risk, haven't we? Yeah. So what have we done to the banker's reward? We've reduced it. Now that's fine if that's what the bank wants, but taking the risk out of things is good if that's what people want, but it's not always what they want. So we might have a bank that says, I'm happy to lend simply on your promise that you'll pay me back, and I don't want anything else but your promise. Your promise is good enough for me. Bracket, and that will be reflected in the interest rate. Right? So you might say, yeah, that's really kind that you trust me so much, but could I do something that kind of takes that whole trust thing out and brings the price down? Right? What if we had some way that we could give the creditor a chance of getting his money back ahead of everybody else. And that's where the concept of security, giving security for your borrowings, comes in. Giving security for equity finance has no meaning, right? Because by definition, the equity only gets paid when all the other claims are discharged anyway. So there is no equivalent concept for equity finance. But if we could give the bank a claim ahead of everybody else, that would bring down our cost of finance. Right? And that's what a security interest does. Right? And the concept of giving security to a creditor for a debt has a very long and established history. And indeed, we look for classic English law security theory back to the Romans. Right? One of the many things the Romans gave to us is a system of security law. First, let's be clear that when we talk about a security interest, we're talking about a proprietary interest, a right in rem, okay, as opposed to a contractual claim or a right in personam. Okay? That's a very important distinction. A proprietary right is a right the creditor has in the asset of a debtor, and a property interest is important because, as you'll recall, property rights can be asserted against the whole world. Not just against the debtor, but against everybody else as well. It's a proprietary interest. So you say to your bank, tell you what, let's bring the price down. You'd like a security interest. My Nan is willing to give you a guarantee. Right? My Nan will promise to pay you if I don't. That, obviously, from what we've just seen, is not a security interest because that is not a property right. That is simply another promise to pay. Right? It is not a security interest. So a guarantee is not a security interest. Do you hear many bankers talking about, yes, I've got security, I've got a guarantee? Yes, that's because they're not very technical, which is good, because they need us. Right? If bankers got all this stuff right, they wouldn't need us, and that would be a bad thing. So we're not talking about guarantees. The three classical characterizations of a security interest: the mortgage, an assignment by a debtor of all of his rights in an asset in favour of his creditor, with an obligation on the creditor to retransfer that asset, to transfer that asset back to the debtor when the secured obligations were discharged. Right? That is the essence of a mortgage, an assignment of all your rights in an asset to the creditor with an obligation on him to transfer it back to you when you have discharged the secured obligations. And as far as the Romans were concerned, if the debt was payable on the 1st of January and you didn't pay on the 1st of January, then the creditor walked away with your asset. Nothing more was required. You had transferred ownership to the creditor on a promise that you would pay him on the 1st of January. You didn't. Therefore, the creditor no longer has an obligation to transfer it back to you. End of story. Now, that's pretty rough if you just missed that 1st January deadline by a pound, isn't it? Right? As far as the Romans were concerned, it's a hard life, suck it up or move on. Right? The courts of equity were a little more accommodating. And so debtors would go to the courts of equity and seek relief from this. They would say, this is unfair. I was a day late with a pound. I shouldn't lose my house. I shouldn't lose my chattels. And so the courts of equity gave debtors an additional right to redeem the asset, to get the asset back, even if they paid late, as long as they paid the full amount that was owed. And that was called the equity of redemption. So you had a contractual right of redemption written into the mortgage instrument, and you had this additional equity of redemption granted to you by the courts of equity. But then the creditor said, wait a minute, because as soon as you start meddling, you mess things up. That's what the Romans taught us as well. The creditor then said, wait a minute, if you're saying that he can come and pay off the loan at any time, how do I ever realise the value of the asset and recover my loan? And so the courts of equity said, all right, we've started meddling. Now we'll give the debtor an equity of redemption. We'll give the creditor a right of foreclosure, a right to apply to the courts of equity to extinguish the equity of redemption. And so the courts of equity would say to the debtor, The creditor has come to us seeking foreclosure, asking for an order destroying your equity of redemption. And we will grant that order effective in 30 days. So you've got 30 days, 60 days, whatever, to pay off the debt. And if you don't do it within that time, the equity of redemption is extinguished and the creditor owns the asset. It's his, because that's what a mortgage is. In practice these days, you will see very, very rarely will you see an action for foreclosure. Right? The remedy these days almost universally is an order for sale. What the court will say is sell the asset, apply the monies in discharge of the obligation, and return any surplus to the debtor. Right? But it's useful to know the theory, so when people go around talking about foreclosing on a mortgage, they're probably not actually talking about foreclosing on a mortgage. They're probably talking about an action to sell the asset to realise its value. The next second category we'll talk about possessory security. Possessory security. A security interest created in favour of your creditor by simply giving him possession of your asset with the intention that he has a security interest. You need 50 quid for the weekend, you go down to the pawnbroker with your wristwatch, you say, here's my watch. Pawnbroker says, there's 50 quid. You go back on Monday, hand the pawnbroker the 50 quid plus another 5, and he gives you back your watch. Right? Easy, quick, simple, cheap, has been used for thousands of years. The possessory security. There's no transfer of ownership. All you have done is transferred possession. When I say all you've done, it's a pretty big thing because you don't have the watch anymore. Right? But a possessory security doesn't require any documentation, does depend on possession. So there's no point. If someone says, I have a possessory security and waves a piece of paper at you, the first question is, where's the asset? Because I've had banks do this to me all. Oh, we've got a possessory security. Okay, why do you say that? I've got a piece of paper. Good, where are the assets? The customer has those. Well, then all you've got is a piece of paper. Okay? So, possessory security. And our third category, the charge. The creation by the debtor of a bundle of rights in favour of his creditor. Right? There's no transfer of ownership, and that would be a mortgage. There's no transfer of possession. There is the creation of a new bundle of rights by the debtor in favour of creditor. The most valuable of those rights will be the right, usually, to take the asset, sell it, and apply the proceeds in discharge of the debt. And that is a third category. Right? So we see there no assignment of ownership. Right? Title remains with the debtor. The debtor retains possession, but he has given his creditor certain rights, proprietary rights, that he can assert against the whole world. The charge. So we have the mortgage, the possessory security, and the charge. Here's another bonus point for you. This one day you will thank me for this bit of advice if you remember nothing else. All charges are equitable. Right? All charges are creatures of equity. The number of times I've had people coming into my office saying, I'm trying to work out how we can convert this equitable charge into a legal charge. And I say, well, you can't, because there's no such thing as a legal charge. And then they say, but I've spent 2 days doing this. And I say, yes, but there still is no such thing as a legal charge. Right? So, all charges are equitable. There is no such thing as a legal charge. Okay? Then, of course, despite the fact the Romans haven't got it all sorted out for us, with a bit of tweaking by the courts of equity, we then had the Law of Property Act in 1925. Before 1925, mortgages of land were done the Roman way. Conveyance, reconveyance. Conveyance, reconveyance. After a few hundred years, you were dealing with a pretty big box of documents. Right? And so the legislature said, wouldn't it be simpler if we just had a book? And in this book, we'll write down every piece of land in the country. And we'll give every piece of land a number. And when you want to take a mortgage over it, instead of a conveyance and a reconveyance, we'll just write your name in the book. And then when the mortgage is discharged, we'll simply cross your name out of the book. And everyone said, now that could be really helpful. But the old timers said, wait a minute, you're giving us, this is a charge, isn't it? Because there's no transfer of ownership, is there? There can't be, because my bundle of documents isn't getting any bigger. No, it's a charge. Well, we've got hundreds of years of knowing what a mortgage gives you. What does this charge thingy give you? So how does a parliamentary draftsman deal with this? And he said, I'll tell you what, we'll call this thing a charge by way of legal mortgage. Hundreds of Roman jurists spin in their graves. Right? It's a charge, or how can it be a charge by way of legal? Anyway, the draftsman said, it's a charge that gives you exactly the same thing you would have had if you had an old-fashioned mortgage. Right? But you can read the LPA from cover to cover, you will not see the expression legal charge. But conveyancing lawyers up and down the country will use the expression as a bit of jargon. And that's where the confusion comes in. People hear this expression, legal charge. That is shorthand for charge by way of legal mortgage. Now you can see why people say legal charge, right? But all charges are equitable. So our creditor could say, I'm happy to lend to you on an unsecured basis. Your promise is good enough for me, but I'll charge you accordingly. Or he might say, I'll lend to you, but I want security. I want a right to your assets ahead of all your other creditors, which brings the prices down. The same creditor can have, different creditors can have security interests in the same asset. You can mortgage your house to the first lender and then give a second mortgage to a second lender and a third mortgage to a third lender. You've probably all done that in property law. Greenacre gets mortgaged 3 or 4 times. Okay. Of course, when you do the second mortgage, I'm talking classical Roman style here, what you're assigning is, of course, not your right to the house, because the first creditor has that. What you are assigning to the second creditor is your right to redeem the first mortgage. Right? And what you assign to the third creditor is your right to redeem the second mortgage, and so on. And you will have seen the old maxim, redeem up, foreclose down, right? When you're enforcing security on an asset with multiple security interests. And needless to say, the law has rules about how you deal with those competing security interests, which we're not going to go into. Just be conscious, though, that when you're structuring your debt finance, we can say to one group of creditors, you get a first-ranking security interest. You get paid ahead of everybody else. We'll call them the senior lenders. Second group, we'll call you the junior lenders. You also have a security interest, but you don't get paid until the senior lenders have been paid. And then we have a third category who don't have any security at all. And we can slice up the claims against the assets into these different levels. Now that's very useful because we can then go to different groups of financiers and offer them a different risk-reward analysis. We can go to really conservative banks and say, how would you like to be a senior lender? We can go to New York hedge funds and say, how would you like a really high-risk, high-return option for financing? And we can now expand the number of different types of people from whom we can raise finance because we can offer them all different levels of risk and thus different levels of reward. Now, with our security interests, we talked about having possessory security where you transferred possession, and then we had mortgages and charges where the debtor remains in possession of the asset. And that raises something of a moral hazard, because when I visit your house or your factory and I see your buildings, your machines, your inventory, you appear to be a person of substance, a person I'm happy to lend money to, right? Because clearly you have all this wealth. How would I know that actually you'd already given a proprietary interest, security, over those assets in favour of another creditor? Right? Now for this we turn to Napoleon, right, who did many interesting things in his life, but he also gave us the Napoleonic codes. Napoleon said the way to deal with this is you have possessory security. If you don't have possession, you don't have security. Now, innocent third parties can't be misled, because if the creditor wants to have security, he must have possession of the asset. Therefore, the debtor doesn't have possession of the asset. Therefore, third parties cannot be misled into thinking he's a person of substance, because the assets have been taken away by his creditor. Now, that's a very simple rule. It's a very effective rule. It's a real hassle trying to finance a company running a business with Napoleonic security. Now, Napoleon actually wasn't really particularly interested in this. But we now fast forward, how can we deal with the moral hazard that Napoleon identified and still allow the company to operate its business? And the answer is, we require companies to register at a public registry details of the securities they create. But it's important to bear in mind the reason why these things are done. It's too often easy to learn what is done without knowing why. The what is important. Right? We get people to start work without knowing the what. We've really got a problem. But knowing the why is very helpful later on when you have to analyse problems or deal with questions. To understand why things are done a certain way is valuable. The reason we register security is to protect third parties. So when you go and visit the factory, you see the machines, the inventory, all the value, you can then look at a public register at Companies House and see that it's all mortgaged to the bank. Right? And thus, in making your decision about whether you extend credit to that company, you now know about the security. And that is what registration at Companies House is for. And Companies House maintains a system of registration for security. Not all security needs to be registered. Right? A possessory security does not need to be registered. And that makes sense because if the purpose of registration is to protect the public don't need protection from possessory securities because by definition you're not going to be misled. Right? In other words, I go to borrow £50 from you and I offer you a mortgage over my watch. Okay? Now you, being a careful and prudent lender, will have one immediate question will spring to your mind. And you will say to me, very interested in that idea, David, where's the watch? Right? And I say to you, haven't got it just now, bracket, because it's at the pawnbrokers. Right? You are able to protect yourself by the simple question of where's the watch and making inquiries. You do not need a system of registration to protect you in the case of possessory securities. The law has also excluded rent deposit deeds from this process because there are so many of them, they just clog up the system. Right? And that every company that takes out a lease winds up putting up a rent deposit deed and nobody was really cared about them, so they were just removed from the system of registration. If you don't register the security, it's void against third parties. And of course the whole point is enforcing it against third parties, so failing to register security is a really bad place to be. Right? It's one of the most common causes of negligence claims against solicitors, right, is registration of security. So you start work at a law firm and you think the partners are really paranoid about whether I registered that security. You're absolutely right, we're going to be paranoid about it. Right? Luckily for you, this can all be now done online. Not yet from a smartphone app, but it can at least be done online. A process that now takes 10 minutes instead of a day and a half, right, which is fantastic because it really simplifies a purely administrative process and helps drive down costs. So you'll be doing that process electronically. We're still going to be paranoid about it. Right, so don't be surprised about that. Now, we have all these different creditors with all these different positions, some with security, some without security. When it all falls apart, the company goes broke, how do we work out who gets what? And it won't surprise you to know there's a set of rules for this, as there are a set of rules for most things. And the Insolvency Act tells us in what order to apply the monies on an insolvency. The first thing that gets paid is the cost and expenses. Don't overlook that. It's very easy to overlook that. The first thing that gets paid in almost every situation I've ever come across, in fact every situation I've ever come across, is the costs and expenses. Don't lose sight of them. right? Because with luck, one day you will be one of them, right? So costs and expenses get paid first. The lawyers, the accountants, all that sort of stuff. Then we have a group of creditors referred to as the preferential creditors, people who rank first by virtue of statute. Now, under English law, there aren't many of those. The scope of those creditors has been dramatically reduced over the years, right? Because it was felt intrinsically unfair that someone should get special treatment. For example, that tax claims should get a special treatment. Corporation tax should rank ahead of everybody else. Why should HMRC be in any different position to any other creditor when it comes to dividing up the company? So over the years, the number of people in that category have progressively got smaller and smaller. There are some anomalies. EU coal and steel levies are preferential. Gaming and bingo tax are preferential. Why? 3 months back pay for employees is preferential. Right? Okay, all right, 3 months, but only 3 months. But then if you've been working 3 months without getting paid, then it reaches a point where it's your own silly fault to keep working. Right? But it does encourage employees to hang in there if they're told, look, I can't make the payroll this month, but we will recover if you just hang in there. And to know that 3 months of that back pay is a preferential claim, that makes sense. Keep people working through what could be a short-term problem. Next, you have those creditors holding a fixed charge. You will have seen charges divided up into fixed versus floating charge. A fixed charge, you can't deal with the asset. The security interest attaches to the asset. You can't deal with it. Works fine for land, buildings, plant and machinery, stuff that isn't going anywhere. Okay. So fixed charge creditors get paid first. Then our floating charge creditors having a floating charge. A floating charge, as the name suggests, floats over a group of assets that are constantly changing. The most common example being inventory. Right. So floating charge creditors will get paid first. That's why banks like having fixed charges more than having floating charges. But we have to advise our banks that unless you control the asset, you will only have a floating charge. You can't control the inventory. If you did, the business would grind to a halt. Can't control the book debts. Business would grind to a halt. Now, when Crown preference was given up, and a lot of the Crown preferential claims were given up in 2002, they said, wait a minute, this will benefit, there'll be a big benefit here to the floating charge creditors. And who are the floating charge creditors in most situations? The banks. So wait a minute, we're giving up a taxpayer preference for the benefit of the evil bankers. No, we can't do that. And so part of the floating charge recoveries go to a special fund to be used to pay unsecured creditors. And when you see that, you think, why go to all this palaver of this little fund taken off the top? That was in exchange for the Crown giving up its preferential claims. Just hark back on our point of registration of charges. Registration of charges is not notice to the whole world. Okay, many people come in thinking if you've registered something at Companies House, it's notice to the whole world, right? And it's not. And it's kind of obvious when you think about it why it wouldn't be, because otherwise every time you went into a shop to buy something, you'd be on notice of a security interest in the item you were about to buy. And so, being a diligent, law-abiding person, you'd go off to Companies House to search the register, at which point, one Saturday morning at Westfield and Companies House computers simply crash. So the system wouldn't work. It is only notice to those persons who could reasonably be expected to search the register. Right? So it's constructive notice to a person who could reasonably be expected to search the register. So you go into Westfield and you buy a pair of shoes. Reasonable to expect you to search the register? No, obviously not. You go into Westfield, into the shop, and you take security over all the shoes in the shop. Reasonable to expect you to search the register? Yeah. You go into the shop and you buy all of the red shoes. Reasonable to expect you to search the register? This is where it all gets a bit awkward, doesn't it? Well, That's a big transaction. You'd think you should search, and it's really easy to search. On the other hand, you go buying lots of red shoes all the time, and so unfortunately, we're going to have these situations in the middle, which is where we make our money. But the important thing is to remember that it is not noticed to the whole world. So we talked about the floating charge creditors. We got rid of them. We're then going to pay the unsecured creditors. And at each of these levels, the claims will be paid pro rata by reference to the amount of the claims. So the unsecured creditors will get their money, and when they're paid off, then the equity gets to share in whatever's left. And if the company's gone into liquidation because it's insolvent, then by definition, there's very unlikely to be anything there. Remember, of course, not all liquidations are insolvent. You can have a solvent liquidation. That's what you do with a company you don't need anymore. So liquidation, and this is another fallacy, people think liquidation equals insolvency. No, liquidation equals the end of the company. The end of the company can be because it's insolvent, or it can be because its purpose has come to an end and nobody needs it anymore. So don't fall into the trap of thinking because it's a liquidation, it must be an insolvency. We'll finish off with the regulatory regimes that apply to issuing debt securities. You could see a real potential for going out to people and raising lots of money by offering them investments in your new company, by offering them bonds, IOUs by your company to raise money. And that rather than go to the banks, why don't you go down to the pub and raise money from your mates by issuing them with bonds, debt instruments, for £10 a throw, and you think I could raise the £1,000 I need to launch my app by simply issuing bonds to my mates down the pub. From a consumer protection point of view, the law really frowns on that, right? Because there's obvious opportunity for fraud and misbehaviour. And so issuing debt securities to the public is generally highly regulated. Issuing them privately to people who know what they're doing is unregulated, pretty much, because they're exactly the kind of people from whom you should be raising money, people who know what they're doing. I have had people say to me, oh no, but the rules won't apply to me because I'm just raising money from my friends and family. And I had to explain that they were usually the ones that are most deserving of protection from you. Right? So, issuing debt securities to the public, often very regulated to protect the public, lots of rules, particular problems with cross-border issues, because the rules on issuing debt securities in the United States are different to the rules here, are different to the rules in France. Hence, if you ever look at an issue document, a very chunky document often that hardly anybody reads until something goes wrong, it'll have a whole list of exclusions. Right? You can't buy this if you're American. That's often the first thing that's stamped in big red letters. Right? In fact, don't even take this document into the United States. In fact, don't even discuss this document with someone by telephone with somebody in the United States. Right? Because the US Securities and Exchange Commission is a pretty fearsome regulator, right? Particularly compared to its English counterparts. But with good reason. Right? The South Sea Bubble, for example, in the 18th century, hoovered up a huge amount of public funds raising money to pursue ventures in the South Seas. The Darien Scheme, which you may have heard about as part of Scottish independence. The Scottish government in the 18th century was going to build a settlement in Panama. They'd seen the success of the English in the Far East. They were going to duplicate this in Panama. And the Darien Scheme took in, at the time, estimated between 25 and 30% of the entire wealth of Scotland have been contributed to this scheme. Right, now that's effective marketing. Right. Needless to say, they picked one of the most inhospitable places on the entire Panama coast, which even today remains uninhabited. Right. Even the locals don't go there. Right. And of course it was one of the things that led to the Act of Union, because Scotland went bankrupt as a result. So, it's very unlikely these days that you could mount such a huge investment program, but it illustrates the thinking behind the role of consumer protection So whenever you see people talking about issuing debt securities to the public, that's where you want to be thinking, wait a minute, regulatory regimes, the penalties can be quite severe, given the obvious risks of people acting fraudulently. And that, I think, brings us just about to the end of the presentation on debt securities. I didn't hear any snoring through the whole performance, which I think is a good sign. Are there any questions? Have we got time for questions? Can we do questions? This would cost you 600 quid an hour, guys, so, you know. And I kept the adware to a real minimum, didn't I? We had Stevenson Howard mentioned once, but that's it. So come on. Questions? No charges. Yes, ma'am.
You were talking about how a lender could convert debt to equity if they wanted, they want the company to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Would they then decide, could they maybe convert it back to debt to have that, more secure?
Okay, so you convert debt into equity. Can you go back the other way? The answer is no, you would just put in more debt. So having started with £100 of debt, converting 50 of it into equity, company takes off, is doing really well, you then want to put in some more debt, you'd put in another 50. To get the equity out, to get the 50 out as equity, in many cases requires a court order. Now you could go to the court and apply for an order to get the money out. So can you get the money out? Yes, you can, but it's a hassle. Yes, sir.
In these very small companies, like with app companies that you mentioned, when they're just starting and they have very, very little capital of their own, aren't there major problems that as soon as you get a decent equity investment, you basically lose control of the company? Because any amount they're putting in, and does that hamper the ability of the company to actually develop it?
Okay, so the question, just because I know this is being recorded, if you get in equity finance, don't you end up losing control? And that's exactly what does happen. So if you go to a vulture capitalist to raise money for your startup, right, he's going to want 30% of your company, at least, if not more. He's going to want a lot of voting control, right? He's going to own you, right? But it's the same deal that the promising young boxer signs up, right, to get a chance in the ring, right? So do you want to play or not? Right? And if it's that or it's nothing, then you take the money and do your deal with the devil. Needless to say, there's a separate talk I do with venture capital funds, so if anybody's here from a venture capitalists are our friends, they will help you, etc., etc. But that's a different audience. Yes, ma'am. Oh, louder, louder. Yeah, the flexibility point on equity is that it's hard to get out, right? And you only get a return as a dividend paid from distributable profits. So that's where your lack of flexibility comes in, compared to debt, which can go in and out without any court proceedings, and where I can get a return, my interest isn't linked to any financial performance. So that's two of the main reasons why I refer to equity as being less flexible than debt. No, I'm conscious that we're getting to the end of our time and I can see the next crowd waiting to come in. So with that, I'll thank you all very much for coming along. Ivan, I don't know whether you want to say anything to finish. No? In that case, remember, Stevenson Harwood, tell all your friends. Thanks for coming along.